Aqua Clan. Welcome to January's video. I have this beautiful frozen lake winter scene here for you today, and this is the reference photo that we're going to be using, and I'm going to walk you through this step by step. So I decided to start off with the sky, and I'm going to wet the paper. I'm using a half a sheet of arches or honeymoon paper. So I just cut them in half. And I'm going to use a cold blue for the sky. But first I have to wet the sky really well. I have a size 20 Da Vinci flat brush here that I'm using. I'm going to take my time and make sure that I don't wet the mountains, because I do want to paint those separately. So just the sky area here, folks. So this first layer will be done in multiple steps because we're going to do the lake next, and that's also going to be wet on wet. So while I have that first layer sinking in here, I'm picking up some of my cool blue. So what I'm using is a little bit of Prussian blue, but I'm mixing it with actually a warm blue, my peacock blue. You could also use phthalo blue, yellow shade, or any other warm blue. So I'm mixing them together because I do want some of that vibrancy, but I don't want it as bright as the lake, because I want those marks on the lake to be the center of attention and the beautiful mountains. Now I have a little dirty brush here, a little bit of some sort of gray on my brush, so I'm going over that section again. Now I decided to tilt my board to get a really nice gradation of colors. Gravity helps, and so I'm mixing up a really thick mixture here for the top part. So the top of the sky is going to be darker, and as it goes towards the horizon line, it will be lighter. So that's why I'm picking up my board here. It's just going to help let that watercolor flow down while it's still nice and wet. Okay, pretty happy with the saturation that I have right now. There's this little mark there in the corner. I was trying to soften it out. So I don't want to fool with it too much. It's pretty nice. I'm going to let that whole thing dry. Now I have a piece of crayon, a wax crayon. A wax crayon is perfect for these kind of skate marks that you see in the reference photo in the foreground. If I was to use masking fluid, it would be too sharp of a difference. It wouldn't look great. Lifting the paint as well as using some gouache, white gouache, will also leave those kind of chalky marks behind. Those are also good options. And actually, I was a little timid with the crayon, and I ended up using all three effects. So I started off with the crayon. I'm just going to preparing my colors here, and I'm mixing up more of a warmer blue this time. So I leaned towards the cool blues for the sky, adding lots of Prussian blue, but now I want to use lots of the peacock blue. Now I am going to make these mountain reflections not as sharp as in the reference photo. I want to soften them a little bit. So I'm going to do the whole lake, including the reflections, all in one go. So using the same flat brush, I'm going to wet the paper really well. And notice I am taking my time and wetting the paper really well, taking a good couple of minutes to do it, because you do have lots of colors, and putting in all the details for the foreground and the reflections of the mountains is going to take some time. So I'm always watching how much liquid that I have on my brush. So I always paint with a piece of paper towel, and notice that my mixture is quite dry. Since our paper is wet, we do not need a whole lot of moisture in the paint itself. We want the vibrancy of the paint, and we don't want it to spread a whole bunch. So those lines are showing up. You can see them, but they're very, very faded, I guess you could say. So they're not as bright as I thought they would be, but we have lots of other options. We can pull those lines out even more later on. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking my thick mixture, have Prussian blue, but I could also mix it with indigo blue. And those really, really dark blues, I'm going to put where all these intersecting lines are to really show all those scratches in the ice. Now I'm going to go for the reflection of these mountains. So I'm adding that horizon line that I see that's quite dark. And I'm going to start from there, and on the right hand side it's more broken and not as defined. So for the reflections of these mountains, my paper is still shiny. If your paper is still shiny, you will get a soft effect. Your brush strokes will bleed and it'll look nice and soft. If your paper loses the shine, then you might have to stop, let the whole thing dry, and re-wet it in order to put in these details of the mountain. Otherwise, it will not blend well and it won't look right. So, but I still have a pretty saturated paper because I did wet it really, really well. So I'm just adding some of these details, the dark edges that I see in the mountains and the reflection. But like I said, I didn't want them to be really defined. I want them to be very soft. Now, to further that softness, you could take a dry, fluffy brush and drag it in the direction that you want the paint to spread and become even more fuzzy. So that's a trick for you, and I do that a lot with a lot of my paintings. So my paper is still shiny down there, and I can still add these really, really dark areas. And notice how thick my paint is. It's a very, very thick. My brush is very dry, and that's how come I'm getting such great dark saturations here. Getting that broken line for the horizon line on that side. Now, to do a little bit of some watercolor effects here, I do want some little tiny blooms here in the foreground. I just thought it would add some really nice atmospheric effects here. And I quite like that. Now that my paper is losing its shine, it is the perfect time to do some lifting. So for lifting, I'm using a script liner brush, and it's a damp brush. It cannot be soaking wet. Otherwise, you will leave very large marks and it won't look right. So I like to call this a controlled bloom because we're using a damp brush. Again, every time when I go to rinse out my brush, I am wiping it off on a piece of paper towel, like dabbing it, so that it's just damp and it's not soaking wet. And I would suggest practicing this on a scrap piece of paper because there's the timing of the paper drying is involved, how much moisture you have on your brush is involved. So it will give you an idea of where you need to be and how moist or not moist your brush needs to be, and that just comes with practice. So it is bringing forth those marks in the ice a lot more defined, and I do like this effect. And I just kind of keep going until my paper is too dry for any of those marks to show up. So my paper is mostly dry, but I want to work on the mountains next. And so I have to make sure it's completely dry because I don't want to wreck the effect that I have going on in the ice right now. So you could either let it dry, or you could dry it with a hair dryer or heat tool. So the mountains are kind of separated by a tiny little sliver there on the horizon line. So to make my life easier, and so I don't have to rush to try to do both mountains at the same time, I'm going to do them individually. So I am wetting the right side of the mountain because I'm left-handed. If you're right-handed, you would work on the left side of the mountain. So I'm just going to get that really good and wet. So for most of this painting, I'm using these new mop brushes that I bought that have this fantastic point to them, and they hold a lot of moisture. So without rinsing off my brush, I just took my very wet brush and dragged it into some of this blue here that we used for the lake. Now, of course, nothing is going to be completely stark white like that, so I do want to put some color on these mountains, and I'm preparing them for all of these darker areas that I see that I could start putting in and dragging across the mountain. So I'm using some of the indigo that I have on my palette, and I want to have a pretty damp brush. I don't want it holding a ton of moisture because all these little areas, I don't really want them to spread a lot. I want to get that texture that I'm seeing for the mountain. So notice how I wipe it off on the piece of paper towel here. Now it is quite dark on this side of the mountain, so I'm going to spend a lot of time, and notice that I have the darkest hues here. So I'm just looking at my reference photo and seeing where I need to add some more paint. So I'm using just the tip of my brush to get in these textures. Now I'm going to drag that wetness across to the left-hand side of the mountain, and I will get that one nice and wet in preparation for our wet on wet techniques here that we're going to do with the same thing with this side of the mountain. And sometimes I tilt my paper so I can see the wetness, the shine, and make sure that I didn't miss any areas. Okay, so with my same wet brush, I'm picking up a bit of blue, just like I did with the other side of the mountain, and dropping in some of this blue. Increasing the color, and notice that now I'm using a damper, or the brush is not as wet. So it's a damp brush, not a soaking wet brush. Going for some of the darker values that I see, and I picked up my indigo blue. So my brush is nice and dry, and I'm trying to use just the tip and the side of it a little bit, so I'm getting some really cool dry brushing effects here for this mountain. And I'm actually going to use some of this leftover paint and dabbing on some of this dry brushing a little bit more on the other mountain. Now, I decided to also use some white opaque paint here. So I have just a little spot here on my palette where I dropped a blob of white. And my brush is damp. It's not sopping wet because I want my lines to be crisp and not too spread out. So I would say I have like a milky consistency here for the paint. And some of these main lines that I see in the reference photo, I'm going for the big ones. I'm not too concerned about the smaller ones. I don't want to overdo it because then it won't look as nice. So I do like the amount of contrast I have between the darks and the lines. And now I'm just sprinkling a little bit of the white paint on there. And that is it. I hope you guys enjoyed January's video. Let me know if you have any questions about the techniques that I used. You could go ahead, sign your painting. You guys just created a masterpiece. Congratulations. Now for the big reveal, taking the tape off, which is so satisfying. I hope you guys did like this. I had really enjoyed making this. It turned out so beautiful. Hope you guys give it a try.